For anybody who's been coming to our church at all, you know this is not our usual altar, but rather this huge image of Paramhansa Yogananda that was part of a play that's been happening here for the last couple of nights. And in just a few minutes, I hope to talk about that. But yesterday morning, in between the two plays, we had a family service. And I don't know how many people were here, maybe 25 or so children from the age of 1 to 12. And I said to everybody, the adults and the children, just as we were starting, I said, you know, this particular picture is really amazing. And if you look into Yogananda's eyes, no matter where you are in the room, he's going to be looking back at you. And so there was one child who's been coming for a while, and he wouldn't sit still yesterday. He was quiet about it, but he was in the back of the room on top of the chairs, and then he would go under the chairs, and frequently his father would be looking under all the rows of chairs to try and find him. And when the family service was over, I went up to him, and I said, what were you doing? He knows me well. He said, Shanti, you told us no matter where I went, God would, Yogananda, he called him God, would see me. He said, I was trying to hide from him. So I said to him, oh. I said, did you succeed? He said, nope. Everywhere I went, there he was. I said, someday you'll know that is a very great thing. This is a really very beautiful reading that we have today. Interestingly, we're part of a Bhagavad Gita book study, many of us, that's going on Monday nights in our community. And we just are studying chapter 13. We just finished, which is where that reading from the Gita that Saranya just read was from. And last week, when I read that list, the whole list, I don't even know if you could pay attention, sort of like, here's what freedom of the soul means. This is what you would look like and feel. And I had to read it 3 or 4 times, and it almost frightened me. I mean, it's so big. And then here it showed up in this reading this week, all those beautiful qualities that we already have. That's already who we are, just shrouded in a way by, by our ignorance, really born of the ego. When I first saw this topic, the title that Swamiji gave this reading, In Surrender Lies Victory, it hit me, of course, what the word surrender means to the vast majority of people in the world. And in fact, I looked up the definition yesterday. I don't suggest that you do this. It's very depressing. But it's all kinds of words like give into, succumb, give all of your power over to forces who, and then it goes on. It's just a horrible thing. I mean, you feel like surrender would be the last thing in the world you'd ever want to do, and you would just feel utterly terrible about yourself if you ever surrendered to anything. But of course, a big part of why Yogananda came was to talk to us very specifically about a whole other understanding of surrender. When I read the title and I had that experience of how most people would hold that concept, very quickly came an image to my mind of a huge, beautiful, big blue balloon, a helium-filled balloon, just taking off and rising. And I thought, now there's what surrender means to us. This is what Yogananda came to talk to us about. That surrender is an upward quality. It's not a sinking down quality. That it is in every way expansive, that it takes great courage and will to really surrender, as Swamiji says so beautifully, speaking about the ego, us surrendering our ego, not an easy task, but that when we do, that we can then rise, our energy can rise and become one with God as spirit. It's so much more uplifting. And Yogananda came really to tell us this, because I think not prior to his coming here, I don't know how many Westerners or people in this country really had any understanding of that. I think we would always think of surrender, even giving over our ego, as a loss, as giving something away, some part of ourselves that we are so deeply identified with, and how hard that would be. How would we recognize ourselves anymore if we let go of that? But through his beautiful teachings, he showed us that we're not letting go of anything as we surrender our ego and all of its ideas and all of how it keeps us bound, but rather we're gaining a whole world that we knew nothing about. The pictures here and the roses are strewn because of this play that we had last night. The title of the play was Whispers from Eternity, which many of you know is the name of a book of what Yogananda calls prayer demands. He's really teaching us. He wrote these down, all of the prayers that came to him, to teach us how to talk to God as mother, father, friend, with a kind of demand in it that we deserve God's love, his attention, his direction. And again, I don't think this is something that was really ever or much thought of by many people, at least in this country, before he arrived. And really through inspiration that's really hard to speak about in the coming together of this play that many of us saw last night, Friday night, up at Ananda Village in the summer. And lest any of you feel badly after I speak about this, I'll tell you that Mahavir, who was really the channel, one of the channels, I will say, for this play to come to us, was just telling me this morning that several people, he said maybe 10, have already told him that the play should be done again. I walked up to him to tell him that, because I think for those of us who experience the play now, and for me it was the second time. I loved this play the first time, but I think the second time I was really able to be so much more a part of what was happening. I was deeply moved by everyone and everything in the play, and by Yogananda's and Swamiji's energy coming through on this dais. But what happened in this play is that the 5 main characters who we first meet come out shrouded in big black capes and hoods, and they're just as contracted as they can be. They find places to just drop on the stage. And soon you realize this is us in our egoic form. We are as small a part of ourselves as we could possibly be, and we don't know it. We have no idea. When you can't see the light, when you have not been awakened to it, You just don't know it's there. There was a woman who had come to the play, and I was watching her. And I watched her be very, very restless with what was being communicated, because it was so subtle and still and full of love. And as the light started coming, which it did through these poems from Whispers of Eternity, either narrated or spoken by the players, and slowly these souls were awakened. Slowly they could listen, they could hear the whispers of the divine. And as they stood up and they take off, they start really shredding their ego. And you watch them become their whole beings. And there's more and more light through the costumes, which were beautiful, through the dancers that could reflect the light to them. And it's exactly our path. And at the end of the play, I've told you enough, but I've only told you about the play. You have to come and experience it. It's an extraordinary experience of these teachings beyond words, really. It's our master's energy. You know, when he said to Swami Kriyananda in 1948, "Did you like Autobiography of a Yogi?" And Swami said, "I loved it, sir." He said, "That is because my vibration is in that book." Swamiji didn't know what vibration was, but that's what happens when we listen to these poems so beautifully pieced together by the people who created this play, and then danced for us, sung for us by musicians. It's Masters and Swami Kriyananda's vibration that is moving us. Swami Kriyananda, in one of his commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, says that very often disciples will go into a room with the guru with questions, and yet when they get into the room and they're sitting in the room with the guru, they suddenly can't think of their questions. And I had this experience. I've had it many times in my life, because I've had the great privilege of meeting a fair number of saints with my mind filled with questions, and rarely have I ever asked one. And I'm not sure that I ever asked Swami Kriyananda a question, because when you were in his presence, just like he was describing in the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm saying it because it's what we experienced here last night. You're in the presence, you went in with intellectual questions that your ego had, and the guru comes to you from this place of super consciousness. And in that place, whatever questions or doubts you had, you're in such a place of peace and love. The questions don't exist there. Suddenly, you just can't even remember them. It's not like you're afraid to ask them. They're neutralized, uplifted, transformed by the very presence of the guru. It's such a beautiful thing. This is what happened to us last night. We were transformed in the presence through all of these different modalities, through the extraordinary inspiration of the people who helped, who heard those words, who saw those costumes, who decided what music of these great saints to sing. And suddenly, we surrendered our egos. There were many new people here last night, new, and some of them have never heard a word of a note of Swami's music. And I went over to many of them afterwards. How was this for you? Many of them were just speechless, speechless. When the ego surrenders itself into these higher teachings, knowings. Such freedom. This is what we call victory, a complete giving over of our ego into the divine, back into the divine. And we experience victory at the soul level. But, as we say so often, not easy. I was thinking yesterday of the story of Bhishma, one of the characters in the Mahabharata, the great Indian epic. Something else that Yogananda did for us. He helped us to see each of the characters in these great epic writings in terms of qualities that we all hold within ourselves. So as we read them, we're saying to ourselves, wow, look at that. I can relate to that. Why is it that I'm remembering Bhishma? Bhishma represents the ego. Good thing for me to remember. But Bhishma, sometime before the story that I'm about to tell you, was given a boon. And the boon was, you never have to die until you choose to die. He represents the ego, saying the ego cannot be beaten out. It can't be talked out of what it believes in. You can't study anything. It has to, with joyful willingness, give itself over. Bhishma was there. He was riddled with arrows. He had been shot with all of these arrows. He was lying on a bed of arrows. That's pretty painful. All of the pain that the ego's willing to go through before it gives itself up, and it can only do that of its own accord. So we need to be finding ways in our life to help that ego know it's okay. Follow me. Listen to this music. Read my whispers. That beautiful poem that Tandava read this morning. So absolutely, utterly perfect for this reading. Really, I don't remember it now, but it was this reading. It was, let me find every way that I can to relinquish this ego into the great soul. But there's this ongoing war. There is a constant war raging between what we always call those downward pulling qualities, whatever it was that had these beings enshrouded in black, keeping the light out, the greed, the competitiveness, just all of it raging, a war right inside of us. Bhishma lives in us, Arjuna lives in us. Those qualities that are different and dark and hidden and can't see the truth and don't like the light live in us. And then all of this light is there. There's this constant struggle. It's a big war that we're trying to win. And we're only going to be willing to step into that battle once we decide we absolutely need to, that we've suffered enough, like we say every Sunday here. In the past, the coin of our redemption was sorrow and suffering, but that coin now has been exchanged for calm acceptance and joy. Those are soul qualities, not qualities of the ego. And we have to find a way to overcome that fear and to find the courage to do the battle. I recently watched a movie about Martin Luther King's life. He was such a great, great soul. But you know, he was the object of enormous amounts of hatred. I mean, violence and hatred. And there were threats, constant threats against him and against his family and his newborn child, death threats. And he just decided he couldn't do it. He just decided, I'm too afraid, I don't have the courage. And he sat down. He went home, he told his wife, who actually, although she knew him in moments, felt some relief about his leaning towards giving up. This isn't just a story out there. This is a story about us. How many times we're afraid. How many times we think we can't conquer fear and weakness, whatever it is, and we decide to give up. But he sat down and he prayed. And he said, God, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. Take it back. Give it to somebody else. I'm not only putting myself at risk, I'm putting my whole family at risk. And so beautifully depicted in this movie that God said to him, Martin Luther, listen to me. No uncertain terms, got his attention. You will fight for righteousness, for justice, for truth. You will fight. And I will make sure that you know in every minute that I am with you. Isn't that just beautiful? And he said he felt that. He didn't exactly hear those words, but he felt it as an expansion of his own consciousness. That he knew in that moment that whatever was seemingly trying to happen from the outside in, that God was always with him. And it was God taking him into those situations. God was those situations. And he said to himself, what could I be afraid of if God is here? Now that's a pretty magnanimous life that he led. And I don't know how many of us are going to get to do anything like what Martin Luther King had to do, was called to do, was given the opportunity to do. That's another thing about it, is that this war is going on, and we're going to be challenged in our own life, in our own ways, inner battles, outer battles, so many circumstances, illness. How are we going to win those battles? Is by seeing each and every one of them as an opportunity to be closer to God. God's going to be with me in this war. Where else would I want to be? This was part of the extraordinary teaching. Another teaching in the Gita is that Arjuna chose Krishna, even when Krishna said, I won't fight with you, but I'll be there. And Arjuna knew that God's presence alone was all he needed to win the battle. God's presence alone. So maybe we won't be called to do what Martin Luther King was called to do, but we each are here for a reason. We each have battles that we need to fight. We each have our own ego that we're trying to help transcend, and an opportunity to share with others. It's no less important in our soul's journey than it was for Martin Luther King. And as we step into them, because we know what Arjuna knew, God's presence in and of itself, the more we invite God in, miracles happen. That's what happens. Then we find those moments in our life that were a time where we knew God was there, or a miracle happened, and we hold on to it for all it's worth, and we keep coming back to it, and we say, I know that can happen. Look at what happened. I had a very dear friend who was on the East Coast, as was I, during 9/11. And I can't remember now if it was September 12th or 13th, but he had to come to California. It was very important, and it was important, and he had to come. And he just, against all odds, gets himself in a taxi in those days, I think, gets out to the airport, just goes to the airport. and how many of you were alive during 9/11? It looks like many of you. But nothing was happening on September 12th and 13th. But he went out there, and the only plane that left from the whole airport that day was the plane that brought him out to Los Angeles. And he kept saying to me afterwards, that was a miracle. I know it was a miracle. He felt at the time that it was the love of his wife who had died that had helped really part the Red Seas. Well, do you hold on to something like that? He's not necessarily somebody who's deeply committed to working a spiritual path. Even to this day, it's not what's going on. But can you keep going back to that story and say to yourself, you know what? God was with me once. That's what happened. Every time I can believe and I can put out that energy, because that's what's necessary. If we're not believing, if we're not opening ourselves to God, we do not have the not just the openness, the awareness, but the magnetism that we need. It's in that belief that God will show up, that he can and does. And every time it happens to us, let us hold on to it and just add to this little pile of miracles that happens. I tell people this all the time in my medical practice because I can't tell you how many times I've seen people find religion when they have something show up on a CAT scan and it either turns out to be cancer or doesn't, but even if it's cancer, it's removed. They're well. Oh, I am so grateful. That was a miracle. I'm never going to smoke again. I'm going to eat right. Yeah, that's for about 3 months. And we just pull those black capes back over our heads. We put the hoods on. We go somewhere else. We forget. There's no light shining because we've shrouded ourselves in darkness. We have to put out, remember I said surrender into victory. It's an upward energy. It takes energy to do that. It's expansive. It's not a passive thing. We have to be finding every moment in our life where we experience the joy, where we see the miracle. Promise ourselves, I'll never forget. I used to keep lists of them because I didn't think I could remember. And by God's grace, my life has just moved into a place where there's enough miracles in my life and my Guru Bhai's lives that I don't forget now, that I'm aware it's always me. If I'm not feeling God, it's always me. Because when we are opening to God's grace, miracles happen. Then we see them, then we know, they touch our heart. Really, the only real miracle is surrendering our ego and finding the victory. It's always what the miracle is, no matter what the miracle looks like in life, the taking away of a disease, an airplane taking off, finding the perfect partner. It's those moments where we've opened to divine grace. We've said yes to life, to this life that is so much more real, to where these beautiful angels last night, these beautiful beings that are aware, that brought the whispers to the people who didn't know, who were dark and hiding with ego. And then these beautiful souls run through this temple, throwing these beautiful rose petals all over all of us. These are sacred petals. They were here. They absorbed Master's vibration, Swamiji's vibration, the inspiration that was flowing through everybody who was up here. I took some of them home. I put them on my altar, really, right next to my Kriya petals. Take some. They're blessed. And we can all be blessed. In surrender lies victory. Nothing less than that. We just start asking ourselves, how do I move further and further away from this dark shroud and put on one of those spectacular costumes that Asha made, utterly spectacular, and prance around in front of your mirrors and say, this is the real me. I can find God. I can really create miracles. And yes, I will.